Hi guys, I am going to create a tutorial for you on how to take a very basic graph from D3 and how to bring that graph into Cursor and then how to improve and modify that graph or change it. So let's get started. So for my purposes, I'm going to be using IDE, which is a programming environment called Cursor. However, you could use windsurf or Visual Studio with a plugin like ChatGPT. Uh, there's a lot of tools available. You can just choose whichever one you have access. So here I've switched to Cursor. I've opened a folder, and that folder is called Basic D3 Chart. There's nothing inside it right now. So what we want to do is we're just going to grab a basic graph from D3 and bring it in to Cursor so that we can start playing around with it. So some other open file. Okay, no more surprises. All right, so let's go to the D3 website. You could use this same methodology for another charting library if you needed a React charting library, or if you need something else. Maybe you wanted to use Apache charts. The concept is more or less the same. Okay, so D3 is a very powerful JavaScript library developed by a guy called Mike Bostock, who is sort of an OG charting genius, I would say. And the problem with it is it's extremely difficult to use unless you've got a lot of experience with it. However, using D3, we can get we can get over that complexity relatively quickly by letting the IDE handle it. Okay, so I'm going to go to examples here. And here we can see there's a bunch of cool examples of different graphs. So let's have a look at this one. A world tour. Okay, it's traveling from different countries. That's cool. Over here we have a bar chart race. I'm sure you guys have seen this sort of stuff on YouTube. Well, this would allow you to make something like this yourself, and maybe putting in your own data. But for our purposes, I want to do something relatively simple just to keep this first tutorial at a manageable level. So let's go here. This is a zoomable sunburst. And now you can see you can click through to the sunburst, and then it'll show you this one, different stuff. So that's kind of cool. You can see here there's two levels, and then you can click through here. It's kind of a nice way to explore your data, especially complex hierarchies. So let's grab this example. So one thing you might notice here is in this example, it's using a way to present the code. Here's the code, here is the chart, and here's the data. Now, how did I figure this out? I figured this out by actually copying this URL and asking ChatGPT about the structure, and it told me it was a JavaScript way of presenting code called Notebook. So the important thing here is that you should be aware that if you don't know anything, or if you aren't aware of what's going on, just ask the AI. Often it can give you the answer. The problem is that you have to know that you have to ask the question, and obviously you have to ask the right question. But it's kind of like you can ask a broad question and then narrow it down. I think with AI, people often make the mistake of asking a narrow question and then getting stuck in a position because they didn't know that they have to ask a broader question and then narrow it down. Anyway, okay, so let's copy this code. So we can click here and you can see it's JavaScript. So I'm going to select this code and copy it. Now, another way I could approach this is I could say, hey, cursor, I want you to make me a zoomable sunburst graph using D3. However, I find it's much easier to start from a working example and then maybe break it as opposed to start from nothing and build it up, because just to get it to this level might take you quite some time. So this is called chart, so let's just pop it into a new file. And we can click here, new file, and I'm going to call this chart.js. And I'm going to paste this. Okay. Now you'll see there's a bunch of errors here. And the reason for that is because it doesn't know what all these things are, right? So, and that's because it's a specific library. So now, one thing I didn't know the first time I did this is that it's quite important to use the right version of D3. And I didn't really know that. And I just said, hey, here's some D3 code. And then Cursor actually installed the wrong version of D3. And then I was like, oops. And then it was trying to make a whole bunch of changes to the code to get it to work, and it actually created a big mess. So one thing that I saw is you can actually add your own code here in Notebook. And again, I figured this out using ChatGPT. And then you can write your own JavaScript. So D3, which is obviously the D3 object version. Okay, and that should work. Maybe I need to execute that. Run it. Okay, maybe not. Ah, okay. And there we go. That's the version of D3. Now, this isn't obviously something that you would necessarily know, and I didn't know it. But I discovered it by just taking this code and D3 ran it by the wrong version. So then I asked a general AI like ChatGPT, how do I figure out what version of D3 is being used here? And it told me, run d3.version. So there you have it. Okay. So we've covered this. We know that it's now version D3 7.9.0. And then we also have the data for this particular sunburst graph. Now, let's go to the data object. Okay, and you can see it's kind of like a complex array of objects. What you can do is you can click on download JSON, and then it will download the data for you. You could also just go into Cursor and tell it to use its own data, but again, it might not structure the data correctly, and then the graph doesn't work. It's easier to just take the data and then change it as opposed to starting from scratch. So downloading the data, and we're going to go to the folder that we created here, basic D3 chart, and called data.json. Okay, so another thing that I love to use, and that has really sped up my workflow, is an application called Super Whisper. Now, you set it up, and basically, when you hit a specific keyboard combination, it will listen to what you're saying and then convert that into text, and it's quite accurate. And I found it's much better for my prompting than having to type it out, because when you have to type stuff out, you get a bit lazy, you take shortcuts. Whereas when you're talking, well, talking doesn't cost you a lot, and you can often then more fully explain what you want. Okay, so I'm now going to press the combination for Super Whisper, and I'm going to prompt Cursor. I have a Oh dear. Okay, wait, is it not working? Super Whisper. Sorry, it wasn't running. Let's try that again. Okay, now it's working. Right, so we can see it working. Let's delete that. Saying there are two files in this folder, chart.js and data.json. I've taken them from the D3 Observable website, and I've seen that the version for this example is 7.9.0. I want to run this code so that I can view it and then make changes for it. Can you look at the current code and install the correct version of D3 so that we can run it? I would also like to be able to make changes to the code and then see those changes as I make them. So could you also please install a Vite server for me? Okay, so now it's gone and translated all that stuff for me. And now if you click here, you can sort of see that cursor has different modes, right? Agent, plan, debug, and ask. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to go into plan, because I've given it quite a lot of instructions. So I wanted to come up with the plan based on what I've given it as instructions, and then I wanted to execute it as opposed to going into agent mode, which we'll go into later. Okay, so now we can see it is busy planning. This can take a while. So, okay, so I just paused that so you didn't have to wait and watch my computer do stuff. But now it's come up with a plan, okay? Current code is written observant notebook style and needs to be adapted for a standard browser environment with Vite. We'll install D3, so that's the version I told it. Set up Vite with HTML, create an entry point. Okay, so then, it's giving you all of this stuff. It's actually often quite important to read what the plan is, especially if you're trying to sort of do something quite complex. In this case, it's not super complex. Setting up a Vite server and installing a specific version of D3 shouldn't be a major lift. So I'm happy to just press build here. Okay. So now it's busy building. Okay, it's writing a bunch of code. It's creating files. And what it's also doing is it's setting up a Vite server. So I'm working on a MacBook here, and I've previously given Cursor permission to run certain commands, which will sort of speed up my workflow. It's important for you to know which files you are allowing it to run, obviously. And I would say be careful with this, but for our purposes and for the purpose of the tutorial, it is quite useful. Okay, so you can see here it's running a command and it says it auto ran the command. Sometimes if you haven't given it permission and it wants to do something like change folder or create folders or whatever, or do npm install, then you need to actually run it manually. It's up to you. Maybe initially do that, and then as you feel more comfortable with the specific commands that you've allowed it to do, then you can let it run automatically. Okay, so now it says you can now start the development server with npm run dev. This will blah, 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 blah. Okay, so let's see if it's managed to do this. I'm going to close this plan, and you can see, oh, it's written a whole bunch of code. And now it's in green because what it's done is it's made some changes to the code, right? This was all wrapped in this chart object, and it's taken it out of here and made a direct import. So you're like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Cool. Keep that. And you can go and check for anything that's new is green. Anything that it's removing is red. Okay. You don't have to go through this every time, but it's sometimes useful for you if you want to see what it's done. I mean, if you don't actually understand what it's doing, then obviously just read it and try and understand. I mean, it's mostly self-explanatory, and you can always ask the AI if you're curious, which I would encourage you to do so that you can get an understanding of what's going on. Okay, so now it's basically said we can run this server, right? So I'm going to open a terminal here. You can open it within or cursor or outside of it. It's up to you, but this is inside. So the nice thing is it opens it in the right folder for me. And I go npm run dev. And okay, then it said, hey, I'm running a server and it's this URL and nothing is working. Okay, that's a bummer. Let's go right click inspect, see if it's thrown any errors. Okay, failed to load resources. The server responded with the status of 404. That shouldn't be a failing error. Okay, but let's just copy this in and then see. I got this error when I tried to run the server and I'm not seeing any charts whatsoever. What do you think is going on? Okay, so now it's switched back automatic agent mode for me, which is probably what we want right now. Okay. Why is it on 301? Okay. Let's see why the shot isn't rendering. Running. Okay. So it's just white. There's no chart running and no errors being thrown. So I'm going to show you an example of just like me being descriptive. I don't know. I don't think this is going to fix it. Okay. What's it doing here? Running command. It's running a headless server here. And now this command has been batched. So but it seems to be stuck here. So I'm just going to force this command through. Errors being thrown. Okay, so now it's speculating on why it could not be working. Let's see what it does here. So already you can see just trying to run a basic example because you're taking it out of this notebook environment and running it directly presents some challenges. Let's see if these changes have now been solved. Okay. This is one. So let's have a look here. Is it running? I don't see anything. No issues to hidden. Okay. And there's no error messages. So I could just say that, but what I want to do is I want to say, hey, let's think this through. So as a programmer, you would like, okay, well, you would break this down into different areas and then eliminate those areas to sort of try and get to where the problem lies. For instance, let's say further, I want you to create a list of 10 possible reasons why all I'm seeing is white and there's no graph showing, and order them in order of significance or probability of being the error based on what you understand of the current code base. And then through a process of elimination, we can try and solve this problem. Okay, and we're going to go back into plan mode and hit that. Okay, so it's basically saying, the script's not loading, so we can put a console login. Okay, and then we can say, okay, so let's go through and debug the possible errors based on your list of and da-da-da-da. Okay, so now it's added a bunch of console logs. You can see that it's logging out a whole bunch of stuff, but there's no data. So I can copy this and I can feed this back into D3 once it's done, and then it'll have a much better understanding of, what's actually happening. The the brown is still just white. Here is the console output. So it's loading D3 properly. Aha! Okay. Well, there we go. It didn't give a width and a height properly. And that's fixed the problem. So now we've got this kind of graph going. Okay, so it's kind of big. So let's say, okay, let's just click through here and see if it's working. It seems to be working perfectly. Great. Okay, let's go through here. Yeah, right, everything seems to be working fine. So great, now we have a basic work example of the graph. Now I want to make a couple of small refinements. So let's say add 20% padding around. You can make spelling errors, it knows what you're talking about. This has just made the space around the chart more, but has not made the chart itself smaller. What I actually want is there to be some amount of padding around the edges of the browser so that the chart doesn't hit the edges. Okay, so that's kind of my fault. I could have given it better instructions, but sometimes you think that the AI knows what you want, and sometimes the AI thinks it knows what you want, but it doesn't. So let's see if this makes a difference. The chart is so large that it is going beyond the height of the browser. Can we add some code or CSS that will make the chart conform with the height of the browser or the width, whichever is smaller? Okay, let's see if that works. Awesome. Okay, so now it's much more digestible. You can see what's going on here quite clearly. Oops, how did that happen? Let's reload. think it was making changes to the code again. Okay, let's just see if we can replicate that problem. No. Okay, cool. Well, all right. So now that we have a basic graph going, we can make all kinds of changes and adapt it to whatever we want, right? So here's another example of, let's say we want to change the color palette here. Let's go and quickly look for a cool color palette. So I'm going to go to a enhance and get a cool color palette. Let's see what it comes up with. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting color palette. That's also quite nice. Let's grab this one. I'm just gonna grab this. Let's say I've pasted in a color palette that I want you to use instead of the current color palette. Based on the colors that I've pasted in, I want you to develop a extensive and well-rounded color palette as would be designed by a professional designer with years of experience and a deep understanding of color theory. Okay, so let's see what it's up with. Awesome. So now let's develop a new color palette. But maybe you're like, well, this data is taking up like a lot of the real estate and it's kind of a bland color. So you can say, I want you to add a function to the page that if I press spacebar, it cycles the color palette forward by one step and applies this to the graph. Now, doing stuff like this is really where it really becomes wonderful to code with AI, because doing something like this would just take you a long time, no matter how good a coder you are. And you would often just not do it because it's such a time shift. But now you can do something like this super quickly and can really help you get to a better product faster. Okay, so let's see if it's come up with something awesome for us. Okay. And let's have a look. So now if there is space, it's changing. That's pretty cool. Now let's say, you wanted to replace this with, departments and employees or whatever. You could just say, update the data, and then you could use this graph for whatever you wanted to for your own purposes. This could be your company or your presentations color palette. You could put in whatever data is relevant to you. You could even say, add a function that allows me to download this graph as a SVG if I press the S button on the keyboard. And boom. Okay. So let's see if that works. So let's just cycle through some. Oops. Oh, again. And it's downloaded as a SVG, which you could now open in whatever you wanted. mean, this is print quality. You could actually use this to generate, amazing illustrations for annual report or whatever. Anyway, this was a very basic tutorial. If you enjoyed this, let me know, and I will make more, showing you way more complex stuff that I have done with D3. But I haven't just taken a base example like this, but I've actually created my own graphs or illustrations or animations